Hello again guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to Microsoft Flight Simulator Flight School. In today's video we're back in the Cessna 152. We're currently on a long final for runway 26 at Bears and we'll be looking at the landing procedures for the aircraft. I do hope you enjoyed the video. If you do, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. If you have any comments or questions for me, please leave them down in the comments section below. But for now, let's jump into the cockpit and begin our approach. So here we are once again in the cockpit of the Cessna 152 and we're on a long final for runway 26 at Bears. As you can see, currently I have the aircraft actively paused. That's just to give us an opportunity to discuss the pre-landing checklist items as well as to discuss the landing process itself before carrying it out. So firstly, the checklist items. The first item on the list is brakes. So we're checking that the parking brake is off and we'll apply some pressure to the brake pedals to make sure that the aircraft's brakes feel responsive. Next is undercarriage, so we check that the undercarriage is down. Obviously the Cessna 152 has a fixed landing gear, however many aircraft of course don't. They have a retractable landing gear and it's a good idea to start memorising these items now. That way when you move on to more complex aircraft you'll already have the checklist item in mind. Mixture is the next item, so checking that the mixture is set as required. Normally you'll just check that the mixture is set fully rich, however when landing at higher elevation aerodromes you might want the mixture leaned to some degree for the landing. Fuel, so we check that the fuel pump is on. Once again no fuel pump in the Cessna 152. And we check the fuel quantities to check that the fuel is sufficient for the landing, as well as any go-arounds or diversions that you might be anticipating. Instruments, so we check that the instruments are reading correctly. Specifically we check that the altimeter is set to the correct QNH or QFE, and checking that the directional indicator is set against the compass. As you can see, the directional indicator currently incorrect due to the active pause, so we'll have to set that when we unpause the aircraft. Landing light, so we check that the aircraft's landing light is on. Carb heat, so once we reduce the engine power for the approach, we'll turn the carburetor heat on to prevent any icing build-up in the carburetor. And lastly we check hatches and harness, so we check that the doors are closed and our harnesses are secure. So that's the pre-landing checklist complete. Now we'll discuss the landing process a little before we carry out the landing itself. So as I mentioned, we're currently on a long final for runway 26 at Bears and we're 1,000 feet above aerodrome elevation. We'll continue towards Bears, initially maintaining our current altitude and airspeed. As we get closer to the airfield we'll start reducing the aircraft's speed. To do that of course we'll come back on the throttle. However, we'll maintain altitude, so we'll have to increase the back pressure on the elevator and trim out any forces using elevator trim, allowing the speed to initially reduce to around 70 knots. Once the speed reduces to within the white arc on the airspeed indicator, we can start taking flap. The flaps on the aircraft allow us to fly at a lower approach speed, as well as increasing our nose down attitude in the approach, allowing greater visibility for the landing. We'll then maintain 70 knots until we intercept roughly the glide path for the landing. We'll talk more about the glide path on the approach as it'll be easier for us to visualise. But essentially we want to maintain a 3-degree path all the way down to the touchdown zone. To do that we'll keep the numbers of the runway direction roughly in the same position of the windshield all the way down final. Roughly about 1/5 of the way up the windshield. Again, we'll talk more about that as we go. Obviously trying to keep the aircraft as closely aligned with the runway centerline all the way down. Once we're over the threshold we'll be aiming for a speed of around 60 knots. We'll cut the engine power and we'll slowly and smoothly pull back on the elevator to keep the aircraft just above the runway, We'll move our eye position from the numbers at the threshold all the way down to the other end of the runway. This will help us judge the aircraft's height above the runway a little bit better. And then just slowly and smoothly increasing back pressure on the elevator until the aircraft touches down. As we touch down, we'll derotate the aircraft's nose wheel. We don't want to just let it slam onto the runway. And we'll then either brake to come off at the closest taxiway exit, or if the taxiway exit is a long way down the runway, we'll delay the braking of the aircraft until we get closer to the taxiway. So we are now ready for the landing. We'll discuss more as we go, but we'll unpause the aircraft. First thing we'll do, we'll set the directional indicator as we discussed. So currently on a heading of about 245. And we'll just run through those checks again. So the brakes are off and checked, undercarriage is down, mixture's rich, fuel is sufficient, instruments are checked, landing light is on, and the hatches and harness are secure. As with the previous lessons, the smoother and smaller amount of control input that you can put in at every point during the landing, the better. If you start putting in rapid or significant control inputs, you'll find that you'll very quickly become unstable, which will make everything much harder. And similarly, the earlier you can get lined up with the runway, the easier that's going to make things for you. So again, for now, initially maintaining the aircraft's speed and altitude. Once we get a little bit closer to the runway, we'll start reducing our engine power. So we'll start reducing power now. Initially coming all the way back to idle power. Car peak goes on. And maintaining our altitude, so increasing back pressure on the yoke and trimming. There's 70 knots. So increasing the power once again, and we want to maintain 70 knots. As with the previous lessons, we're using pitch to control the aircraft's speed and power to control our descent rate. We are now in the white arc on the airspeed indicator, so we can start taking flap. So we'll take a stage of flap. And we'll start descending towards the touchdown zone. Take another stage of flap. You can see we're getting a touch slow there, so we'll increase the pitch. And you want to keep the numbers at the threshold roughly in the position I have them now in the windscreen. Full flaps now. And our checks on final, we check that pitch is full fine, again not applicable to the 152. Undercarriage is down, flaps are set, landing clearance is not required, and the runway is clear. So reducing the speed to around 65 knots now. As I say, we want about 60 knots over the threshold. All the while tracking the runway centerline and keeping that visual reference in the windshield with the numbers. So the car peak goes away just before landing. That way we won't accidentally go full power on the engine with the carburetor heat. Still aiming for those numbers. And we're over the threshold now, so coming back on the power. And just holding the aircraft off, steadily increasing that back pressure. And touchdown. We're not going to make that exit, so we'll aim for the next exit, derotating the nose wheel. We're not braking yet, keeping the speed up just to occupy the runway for as little time as possible. And in fact, we'll even use a little bit of engine power just to get off the runway a bit more quickly. We always want to occupy the runway for as little time as possible. That reduces the chance of anyone behind us having to go around, and of course just makes the runway more readily available for others. Braking now, and using the rudders of course to turn off the runway. We're not officially clear of the runway until we taxi past the holding point, so we'll taxi past the holding point and bringing the aircraft to a stop. Set the parking brake and we'll bring the engine back up to 1000 RPM. So there you go, that was a very typical landing in the Cessna 152. In the next lesson we'll be carrying out some circuits with some touch and go landings as well as another full stop landing. So we'll discuss everything that we just covered once again in the next lesson, just to reiterate the process. So there you go guys, that was a landing in the Cessna 152. Hopefully that gives you a decent idea of how to carry out the approach. As I mentioned, we'll be covering the same topics again in the next lesson as we carry out our traffic patterns and touch and goes, as well as one more full stop landing. Once again, I do hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. That really helps the channel to grow. I really appreciate the support. If you have any comments or questions for me, please leave them down in the comment section below and I'll do my best to answer them. But for now, thanks very much and I'll see you all again soon.